Hi, this is Sandra from Greyd, and I like to show you in this video how to use the global styles in Greyd.Suite to set the design of your website globally. So let's just open the site editor that can be found here in the WordPress menu under Appearance and go to Styles. At first you can switch between different theme styles, thereby really easily changing the entire look and feel of your website. And here you will also find the style book, which is a preview of all blocks that are available as they are currently designed globally. But we are now going to take a closer look at the global styles. Before we start, you need to know that there are actually two global style segments. We have this one and we have the global Greyd styles. Why is that? Well, the WordPress global styles, in our opinion, are currently not yet enough. So there are lots of options we want to offer to you. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's not possible to include them directly here, which is why we have this second panel here. And yeah, let's just dive in and start with colors. We are in the WordPress global styles and can here define our color palette that we can later use in all blocks on our website, and we can define lots of colors here. And also, if that's not enough, you can even add more here. You could in theory also create gradients globally for your website, but you need to know that they are hard-coded. So when you, for example, define a gradient with that yellow here, and then you later change the yellow in your color palette to orange, the gradient will still remain yellow. This is why we recommend to deal with gradients individually in the blocks where you'd like to have them, for example in columns or content boxes, because there our settings are coded dynamically and they always refer to your current global style. So whenever you change that yellow to orange, then the gradient will also change accordingly. So much on the colors. Now you can select from this color palette say for example I want this color for any texts on my website. I want that color as a background, very nice. And yeah, there are lots of elements there where you can choose from a color palette. But that's the first thing where we say there are not enough options here. For example, if you take a look at the button here, you can have text color, background color, you can add a gradient, but there's no hover effect, for example. For links, there is a hover effect. So it's not really fully complete in our mind, in our opinion, and that's exactly why we've added lots of options here. We'll have a closer look at that later. Just for now, whatever you can define here in the Greyd styles, do it here, and only do the rest. For example, colors for text, do that here. Okay, so much on colors. Now let's take a look at typography, and therefore we will switch to the Greyd styles first, because here you can upload or define up to 3 different fonts globally for your website: body, heading, and highlight font. You can select from lots of web safe fonts, modern fonts, and Google fonts. And here we have also added an option to host Google fonts locally, which is very important for European websites or for websites that are available in Europe for GDPR reasons. So that's just one click here, very easy. And of course, you can also work with custom fonts and just enter the font name here and upload the font file that you receive from Adobe or Google or whatever, and upload it here. Then we can move on with font sizes. Here we have up to, I think it's 7 default sizes, from huge to tiny, that you can define globally and later use in your blocks. And you can either work with fluid typography, so you add a min and a max value, and the browser automatically does the rest for you. There's also a very interesting tutorial video on that, because this has a lot of possibilities for responsive web design without having to deal with breakpoints all the time. So I can only recommend to watch this tutorial. For now, just you can do it fluid, or of course you can also work with static values. By the way, whatever you define here or generally in the Greyd styles, please do not forget to click on save, because that's another thing where it's currently not possible to integrate in the native save procedure. So there's an additional save button here. So we have the font, we have font sizes, and now let's have a look at typography here in the Greyd and the global styles. As same with the color, you can now define, okay, which of my fonts do I want to use for text, and then which size, which of my fonts do I want to use for headlines. You can also define H1, H2, etc. individually, and some typography settings, etc., etc. And yeah, here again we have the same thing. You could define buttons globally here, but we highly recommend to deal with buttons here in the Greyd styles, since we have lots of additional options here. At first, there's some basic settings that apply to all button variants, which is the font, size, font weight, etc., spacings, and all these kind of settings. And then you can define up to 3 different button variants that you can later, when you add a button somewhere, let's go to the block settings, you always can select between your different button styles. So there are 3 ones: primary, secondary, and alternative. You have lots of color options. You do have a hover effect everywhere. You can work with border radius, border, shadow, etc. 3 times. And there are also some individual settings for large and small buttons in terms of size. Here you have the presets that we've earlier defined, and spacings. Same not only for buttons but also for input fields, for example in forms, in search fields, and these kind of things. Here again you have some basic settings, more or less the same as we've just seen with buttons. And here you have 2 variants, primary and secondary, again with hover effect, border radius, border, etc. And you can also define the labels globally for your entire website. So much on that. And yeah, as I've said, all the other things you can do here, typography and colors. But one word here on blocks. You could theoretically define each and every block that you have globally here in the global styles. But there are several reasons why we recommend not to do so. First one, for example, let's stay with the button example. You already see there are different kind of buttons, and this does not really work good if you set something here and you have different settings here. It might not work properly, but that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue in our opinion is that these settings here apply only to that particular block. And you can imagine that there are several types of buttons on a website. For example, you can have regular buttons in the content, but you can also have, for example, submit buttons in forms. And usually you want all buttons to use the same settings, or maybe you work with the variants. But if you define a button globally here, that doesn't mean that your submit button in the form will have the same styling. Same for texts, for example. Quotes will look completely differently, text in forms will look completely differently, or in search blocks or whatever. So yeah, just so you know, you can use these settings here, but they are really just for this one individual block. Okay, so let's move back to the Greyd styles and have a look at spacings, which is really interesting. You might already have noticed that in several blocks, like for example this
group or box here. You often, when it's about spaces or sizes, let me have a look where you can see it better. No, here not. Maybe here. We've just been there. That's typical if you search something. Here we have one of the settings. You will see in many blogs when it's about spaces, paddings, margins, etc. That you can work with these kind of presets. You can always enter individual values, but you can also just work with these presets. And in Greyd.Suite, you can define these 5 presets completely individually and with lots of options. And that's what you can do here in spacing. These extra large, large, medium, small, and tiny are exactly these 5 presets that we've just seen. You can, of course, work with static values. You can work with min and max. And you can also use this advanced clamp option here. I'm not going into detail here. It is a little bit complex, but it offers you a lot of possibilities in terms of responsive web design. And this is exactly why we have a dedicated tutorial video on that in our help center. Yeah, so much on spacings, and there is some more in the global styles and the layout. Here again, you can see the spacings. You can define the padding and margin and block spacing for your website globally here. Block spacing is the space in between here, for example. You can work with those presets here, padding, margin for your website. And what's also very interesting is the content and wide width that you can set globally here. If you've worked with a page builder, also with the previous version of Greyd.Suite, you might be familiar with the concept of rows. There is row XL, L, M, and S usually, and that's kind of similar. So content width, for example, it's really easy to see if we put it like that. Content width, as the name already indicates, is the width, the default width of your content, and it's comparable to row L as you might have known it from other tools. Let's do it like that, it looks better. So this is the width globally defined that your content takes, and you also have a wide width that you can add, and of course there's also full width. And in your blocks itself, let's see if I find here example, you have these alignment settings here, and you can choose none. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong. Always have to look. Here we have it. Yeah, exactly. When you see these options here, you can work with none, which means exactly content width. You can work with wide width, that's this one here. And of course, you can work with full width. And in the blocks itself, you can also always say, I don't want to work with the global styles, global settings, but I want to define everything individually. So much on the layout settings. Let's just see if we've covered everything. Yes. What do I want to add additionally? In GreydHub, the management platform, you can also import and export your global styles and then migrate it to other pages or other sites. And here you can also add global CSS to your website. And last but not least, if we go back to the Greyd styles and open the grid settings, you will see that you can even customize the breakpoint settings that are used for your entire website. You have the default values here, but you can customize this as you like. And further down, you will also find a very interesting option. You may remember we just talked about the content and wide width layout settings here in the global styles. And as you can see, you can also define those values in a static way. And if you want to use this feature in a more advanced way, you can override these settings with the settings here in the Greyd styles, since you will find min, max, and clamp settings here as well.
For more videos and information, please visit our help center.